to your generation, the message I have is the most exciting questions in neuroscience remain unanswered. Maybe some of them will be answered, hopefully, in the next 20 years, and maybe they will have the privilege of being part of that. It's a really exciting time to become a
Wow.
neuroscientist or a scientist in general.
I think that being able to question everything, using that critical thinking to their advantage, I think is the main like way that people can fully understand something and kind of see through it and beyond failure.
I'll say, in one sentence, don't stop asking questions. The second that you stop asking questions, you stop learning. And it seems pretty simple, but it's very profound.
Welcome back to Stemming the Gap, where we bridge the gap between the majority and minority through productive and insightful conversations about science, education, and opportunity. As we continue our series highlighting minority voices in STEM, giving students a chance to hear directly from scientists whose journey can inspire the next generation, I'm excited to welcome Dr. Daniel Colón Ramos. Um, he's a neuroscientist, a professor at Yale University, and an investigator in the Howard Hughes Medical Institute. His research explores one of the biggest questions in biology of how the brain builds itself and how neurons connect to create the circuits that allow us to think, learn, and interact with the world. Beyond his research, he is also passionate about mentoring young scientists and expanding opportunities for underrepresented communities in STEM. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, thank you so much, Winston. I'm very excited to talk to you today.
Yeah. To start us off, can you just introduce yourself to the audience? Tell us a little bit about the work that you do.
Sure. As you mentioned, my name is Daniel Colón Ramos. I am a professor at Yale University, and my laboratory is interested in how we form memories and how the brain develops. The way I explain my work is that I say, right now, you and I are having a conversation, and what's happening is that I am emitting sound waves with my vocal cords. Those are
Yeah.
physical waves that are going through the air and are getting recorded in this case. But those sound waves, when they hit the hair cells of another human being in their ears, they somehow get transformed into ideas. And I'm interested in what happens in that black box that we call the brain,
Hmm.
in both the creation of the sound waves, the interpretation of the sound waves. And I I'm not specifically interested in speech. I'm generally interested in that
The
mystery of,
neuroscience. Hmm.
yeah, exactly, what is a memory. I don't know if this is the soft start that you wanted, but this is kind of
No,
like,
I know this is
this is
perfect.
what keeps me up at night. This is what I'm really passionate
Hmm.
about. Like when I was about your age, I frequently wondered, when you think about, I don't know, like what you did last weekend, or
Yeah.
the face of your parents, or like, a loved one or something like that.
Hmm.
What is that memory in our brain? Like, how is that manifested? And I've been lucky to be able to make a career out of it, and that's what we work on.
Yeah. I find that so interesting because I feel like me and Gavin took a psychology course together in high school, and me and him were like always curious of what happens in the brain. Right? There's always
Exactly.
these like theological like reasonings and stuff like that, but where there's no scientific definition or answer. And I think that what you're doing is what kind of drives people like us and our curiosity. I
Yeah.
always like to. Oh,
And
sorry.
I will add to that that, like, you took psychology, and I think psychology studies like how the human brain, in some cases, how the brains of animals, how they
Mhm.
enact behavior. I approach it more from, like, an understanding that the brain is composed of cells, and
Yeah.
then I'm interested in how those cells are organized to compute, to allow us
Mhm.
to, for memories, to allow, so they're different. One thing that I like to explain about research when people start is that there are different ways in which you can answer a problem. There's not just one way of answering a problem. So when scientists think about the brain, some scientists think about the brain from a psychology side, which is more like, okay, so how does the brain as an organ um, lead people to do certain behaviors, even behaviors in
Mhm.
the context of society. And then there are other scientists like me that are thinking more like, okay, how are these cells inside a brain organized? And then there are even people that are thinking at a molecular at more biophysical level, like how are the currents of the brain working, how are neurons communicating with each other.
Yeah.
So there are many different scales. My scale is more at a cellular scale,
Yeah.
but there's no right way of doing it. These are all complementary approaches that feed off each other to create a more like a better picture of how the brain works.
Wow. That's so crazy to think about that you have that kind of mindset or like that, diving a little bit deeper in that kind of analytic point of
That's
view.
right.
Um,
Yeah.
what was kind of like those defining experiences that shaped you as a scientist? How have they shaped you today?
I like now I as we go through the interview, I'm gonna be able to like explain
Yeah.
a lot of what I do. But when I was younger, I just want to verbalize this for your audience. These explanations were not as clear in my head. But they were more like
Hmm.
feelings. They were things that I liked. Like you talked about a
Yeah.
feeling that you had when you took a psychology class and things that you were like, oh, that's cool. Oh, I didn't think about it that way. So that's how
Wow.
I experienced it too. That's normal to experience it that way. At first, it's a feeling. It's like, and when I was younger, like my first experiences were ones in which I will like some people like machines and they wonder how machines work. For me, it was animals. Like I would look at animals, and at first I didn't know what that meant in terms of careers. Like I thought, oh, maybe
Hmm.
I should be a veterinarian or maybe I should be a doctor because maybe I like to help people. And but but my curiosity always, like frequently, not always, but frequently led me to question like to look at ants and be like, well, how are they? How do they know where to go? And how are they self-organizing and like that those type of questions. Like I grew up in, we'll talk about it more probably later, but I grew up in Puerto
Yeah.
Rico. It's a tropical rainforest. Like I
Mm.
say that in every environment, this is not like, I'll speak about my experience in Puerto Rico, but I'm sure like a kid growing up in New York or Connecticut where I'm at now, or anywhere in the world actually, will have a relatable experience where they're growing up in an environment, there's things going on in that environment and they have questions about it. For me,
Yeah.
in my environment, there were these sea turtles. They're called leatherback turtles that they hatch at a beach. That the beach that I'm talking about wasn't very far away from where I was born and raised, so you could see them. They're tiny when they hatch, a couple of inches long, and then they disappear into the ocean. And it's quite a sight because you have this tiny, vulnerable little thing just disappearing in the vast ocean,
Yeah.
and you wonder like how does he know where to go, how does he know what to do, like
Mm.
but later what happens is these animals grow up to be about 9 feet long, about the size of a car.
Oh.
They travel the world's oceans, and then when they have to make the most important decision of their lives, which is where they're going to lay their eggs, they remember that beach and they come back to it. So I used to think as a kid, I was like, well, how does he know where to come back? Like it doesn't have a map.
Hmm.
Like how does it? So and that those kind of questions, which at first there were questions that I didn't know how to answer. There are questions that still lack answers, as a matter of fact. But like there were feelings, right? There were feelings where I was like,
Yeah.
oh, this is a cool question. Like how does this work? And that's how it looked for me, and I think that's how it looked for a lot of scientists when they first start.
Actually, kind of questions me because I was doing a little bit more research about you, and if I remember correctly, like I think what I was reading was that you use like worms as like a way to think
That's right.
for like the human brain. And can you give
Yeah.
me a little bit more on that? I found that so fascinating. It
Yeah.
was like the one
Absolutely.
thing that struck out to me. Talk to me about your research and what you're doing now, especially incorporating kind of that worm analogy and how
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
works into
Absolutely. So we
understanding
use
human brain.
when I tell people that I use worms, they usually think about earthworms, which is the worms that most
Mhm.
people have seen. These worms are different from earthworms.
Mhm.
They're about 1 millimeter long. That means that they're about the size of a comma in a sentence, and importantly, they're transparent. And
Mhm.
the reason we use them, and the reason that it's important that they're transparent is because I mentioned to you that we're interested in understanding how cells self-organize into brains and how that then instructs behavior. So in this worm, unlike in a mouse or in a human or even in a fruit fly, we can actually, because it's transparent, we can see the single cells inside the animal. And we have tricks to
Mhm.
be able to label those cells, but it helps us that the animal is transparent because then we can use a microscope and see right through it.
Has there like ever been like what are like the most surprising discoveries that your lab has ever made?
Yeah. There are a couple that I'm really proud of. One of them is that when the way that the circuits form is two neurons find each other and connect to each other and they form a junction that is called a synapse. And synapses are
Mhm.
actually quite similar. If you look, if I show you a picture of a synapse by electron microscopy of a worm and one of
Mhm.
a in a human brain, you wouldn't be able to tell the difference because it's such a
Yeah.
fundamental unit of computation that is the
Yeah.
same. It's like if I show
Similar.
you like in your iPhone, I show you some microchip circuit, and you don't know if it's
It
from
looks
the
the same
iPhone. Exactly,
for
it
the
looks the same.
Android.
So,
Mhm.
for the Android, exactly. So it's shared. So those synapses, like they need to form when two cells, like a presynaptic neuron and a postsynaptic neuron, they connect to each other. That happens during development. And people used to think that in order for them to find each other, they were kind of talking to each other. Like they were sending signals to find each other and then connect
Oh
to each
yeah.
other specifically. So people used to think that way. And we found that instead there's a third cell that's kind of like a matchmaker. It's like if a friend sets you up with a date kind of thing. Like there's a third cell that is a coordinator. And these two cells are not talking to each other. They're actually talking to that third cell that is telling them, oh, you need to meet here. The reason that
Mm.
discovery became important is because that third cell is not even a neuron. It's a cell called glia cell. And a glia cell is a cell that usually neuroscientists ignore because they're like, glia in Greek means glue. It's a
Mhm.
cell that's kind of in the nervous system. Everyone knows they're there, but no one knows what the hell they're doing. So they're
Mhm.
like, so our finding of how important they are in development to bring these two cells together to coordinate the development of the nervous system and the function was actually something that reframed the way people thought about both the process of how circuits form, but also the role of cells like glia in the cells coming together. So that's one example. Another one that more recently that we've been working on has to do with like essentially like in all our thoughts are powered by energy. So an energy is not, like you probably, you and your friends probably feel this all the time. I certainly do, which is like, your energy state changes during the day and your
Yeah.
capacity to perform different tasks, motivation, how could you can focus, etc. It's gonna change during the day. And we became really interested in how that happens at the level of cells in the brain. And what we're finding is that different cells have different energy levels. And how those energy levels change actually interfaces with how the brain can compute, it interfaces with how the brain can perform tasks, it interfaces with how we even believe like how memories form. So we're studying that. We call it the cell biology of energy metabolism. Cell biology is the study of how things are distributed in cells, and
Mhm.
energy metabolism is the process by which the body makes energy. And people usually don't think about energy at a cellular scale. They think about energy as something that's happening at the level of the whole organism. So we're trying to
Yeah.
reframe that also for the brain.
Wow. I feel like all that stuff is very complex. It's just something that like you can't be taught in a day. It's like it's extensive research. What do you and like it kind of questions me like where do you see neuroscience in 20 years from now? If that complex, where do you see
Oh
it now?
man,
Do you
that's
see
like
it
that's a losing
closer?
bet right there because that's a losing bet right there. I guess I can tell you, like I look 20 years back. I look 20 years back in
Yeah.
my life, and my first, like maybe not 20 years, but maybe 30 years back, like I was the first class in the 90s in college that used the internet. Like so much has changed in my lifetime, and so much is gonna change in your lifetime. It's totally unpredictable. Like even
Yeah.
AI in the last, like the changes in AI in the last 10 years, particularly like the hour facing changes in the last 5 years, it
Yeah.
makes answering that question so hard. But I can tell you that I'll say two things to that. One of them is the most, like, when you're in school, usually your relationship to questions as a student is it's distorted, and I'll explain what that means. It's like when you're in school, when somebody asks a question, they expect you to give an answer, and the
Yeah.
answer is the end of that exchange. If there's a question, you give an answer, and if you don't have an answer for the question, then you're at fault, right? You're like, you didn't study, you didn't prepare yourself, etc. That's how knowledge is taught at school. In science, it's the opposite. Like in science, I will say science is kind of real life, right? So in science, each like answer ends up with a question, versus in school, each question ends up with an answer. so
Yeah.
so I think that's an important concept I emphasize, and the reason I emphasize that in the context of your question is because I want to emphasize that the most interesting problems in neuroscience and in biology don't have answers yet, or don't have satisfactory answers. What is a
Mm.
memory? How does Alzheimer's works? And like, how does Parkinson what happens in Parkinson, in Alzheimer's, for example, which is a disease that is so devastating and people lose their memories. How are you going to cure that if you don't, if neuroscience does not still understand what a memory is? So how can you find something that you lost if you don't know what it is? So,
Hmm.
so we need to understand the fundamentals about how it works before we can actually treat diseases. And that's why some of these, what's called basic scientists or fundamental scientists like myself, that's what we're
Hmm.
trying to do. We're trying to understand what a memory is before we can even aspire to cure Alzheimer's. But to your generation, the message I have is the most exciting questions in neuroscience remain unanswered. Maybe some of them will be answered, hopefully, in the next 20 years, and maybe they will have the privilege of being part of that. It's a really exciting time to become a
Wow.
neuroscientist or a scientist in general.
Yeah. Wow. That's such a great answer. I did not expect that. Like, I think that it's so interesting and intricate how that comes to play, especially with neuroscience. Like, I feel like that's such a topic that not a lot of people seem like are in tuned about. There's obviously the biology, the chemistry, but neuroscience is kind of that topic that where it's not really explored as much. Kind of going back, I know we talked about 20 years in the future, but 20 years looking back, talk to me about your entire journey, how you started in Puerto Rico and how you started and you came to the United States or the
Yeah,
mainland country.
yeah, yeah. I was born and raised in Puerto Rico. I spent a lot of my time in my childhood in this rural area of Puerto Rico called Barranquitas, which is in the middle of the island. I grew up between there and a city that's closer to San Juan that's called Guaynabo.
Hmm.
And I think Puerto Rico is a tropical rainforest, and it has kind of, as a country, has a lot of like biodiversity, and that inspired me. Like that inspired many questions. But like I say, that I don't think that's unique to Puerto Rico. That was my context, but I think any context that you're in, if you are paying attention, you should be asking a lot of questions because things are magical. Like if you really pay attention, the things that are happening around you are magical, and for many of them, we don't have explanations. And that's where science is really useful because science allows you to create a framework and explanation of how something might be working that extends our understanding and then extends our capacity to even manipulate it or take advantage of it. So, but in my case, I grew up there. My relationship to science early on was complicated because I didn't love my science classes. I think in part I didn't love my science classes because of this relationship to the questions that I was sharing with you before. I felt like every question that I had, somebody would provide some sort of answer, sometimes an answer that wasn't totally satisfactory. If I pressed, people would kind of get pissed off that I was asking too many questions. And so it wasn't until maybe later in high school where I had some teachers that really started, my parents for sure, and maybe some teachers that I had that were supporting my questioning of things, that I started becoming more excited about science. I participated, in some, like, the science fair and things like that. Although I have to say, it's really hard in high school. It's really hard to like do something like the science fair because that's not how science works normally. It's not
Yeah.
you're not doing it part-time, you're not taking classes. As a scientist, I'm full-time doing it, you know what I mean? It's not like
Yeah.
you're not asked to do something in 9 months without context. So I think it's a tall order for high school. If I guess my message is for your friends, if they have had a negative experience with the science fair, they shouldn't get discouraged because it is not the typical. If they've had a positive experience, wonderful. But if they've had a
Hmm.
negative experience, that's not uncommon, and that doesn't mean that you're not that science is not for you. So then later in college, I had more opportunities to work in labs and pursue scientific questions. I came to the States for college, and it was a big transition for me because I came from tropical Puerto Rico to like
Yeah.
frigid Massachusetts. For me, it was like a night and day type of thing. And so I went to Harvard University for college. And then when I finished there, I have to say I was still a little bit lost about what I wanted to do career wise because while I had worked in some labs, I like still like as a college student, I had not fully experienced science. Like I was still taking science classes, which were again like here's the question, here's the answer type of thing. It wasn't kind of curiosity driven classes, and And I finished, and I was like really lost. I didn't know if I wanted to. It also felt like for me, like science felt like, well, will I be able to interact with people? Will I be? I liked interacting with people, and science. I had this idea that science was kind of like a lonely type of career where you are on your own thinking,
Yeah.
which is totally a misconception of how scientists work.
Yeah.
Now in retrospect, we're super collaboratively and we're constantly learning from each other. But anyway,
Hmm.
but when I finished college, I went back to a person I had met, and who was a Puerto Rican professor at Duke University, and I talked to him about these concerns that I had, and he looked at me and he said, "Look, I've never had those concerns myself, but if you want to figure them out, there's only one way of doing it, and that's for you to practice science, for you to be in a lab full time, at least a
Yeah.
year, and see how it feels." And I did that after college, and I loved it. I did it for like 1 year, then applied to grad school, went to Duke, finished my PhD there. My PhD advisor is now it's Sally Kornbluth. She's now the president at MIT. She since left Duke,
Wow.
and at the time she was like a starting professor. It's really cool to also see the trajectories of these people that you share a journey with in science. And then
Yeah.
from there I went to Stanford, and I worked with, and that's when I started working on C. elegans, this worm that we talked about. And then from there I came
Hmm.
here to Yale, where I'm a professor.
Wow. Your story is so inspiring. I feel like that's something that in the beginning I was hoping to touch upon, but I feel like that your journey, and as I was doing more research about you, it's like it's very inspiring, especially from the place that you came from. As a Puerto Rican scientist who's built a career on the, some of the world's leading research institutions, you've experienced many different scientific communities, would you say?
Yeah, no, it's been a privilege to be able to work there and to work with so many wonderful people from all parts of the world. One of the things that I love about science is that it's super international, and you know, there's so many people that contribute to science, and it's not just one demographic. It's part of the stereotypes. And I find that
Mhm.
inspiring to be able to work with people like from all different walks of life that share this common humanistic, ambition of understanding how things work.
Wow. How do you think that your identity and background has shaped your journey? What barriers do you still think exist for underrepresented students pursuing careers in STEM?
Science is a lot about understanding and managing vulnerability because you're constantly facing the unknown. So I think as a
Yeah.
minoritized scientist, minoritized students are many times signaled, students in general, I have to say, but certain demographics more than others in this country are signaled that it's not okay not to know, that it's not okay to ask, that it's not okay to show vulnerability. And if you don't show vulnerability, you deprive yourself from the learning process. So you need to face the unknown to learn. If you're always facing what you know, you're not learning by definition.
Yeah.
If you're not asking questions, you're not learning. So that that psychological roadblock of not feeling that if you show vulnerability, you're going to be taken advantage of, or people are going to put you
Yeah.
down, which is very real for all students, but particularly for minoritized students. It's something that will get on the way of your development in many areas, but particularly in science, where facing the unknown is the business. I mean, what I do for my job is face the unknown and ask questions. So if don't feel comfortable facing the unknown because that makes me feel vulnerable, if I don't feel comfortable asking questions, then I'm not going to learn and I'm not going to make discoveries. And I think that is a very real barrier coming from a minoritized background. I think there are other aspects though that prepare you for some of the things that you're going to face in science. Like science has a lot to do with tenacity and perseverance.
Yes.
And I think if
Hmm.
if you have overcome barriers in your life already, like to get to where you are, those skill sets are going to help you become a great scientist. It will help you in many other areas too, but particularly science will help you become a great scientist because when you're facing the unknown, you're going to ask questions that are not going to give you straightforward answers, and it's the ability to persevere, to think deeply, to to continue to show tenacity that will ultimately bring you to the answer.
Wow. Funny enough, you actually answered my next question about, the advice to the young students who are, face maybe setbacks or, rejection. kind of the main question that I wanted to focus on, especially regarding advice for young students, is can you think of a time where something didn't really go according to plan, where you had maybe ultimately opened a door for a better opportunity?
Oh, absolutely. I think most of like, there's so many examples. It's hard for me to pick one because the most exciting discoveries in science happens when you're thinking about something one way and then you realize that you were thinking about it wrong and you have to rethink it. Like the example I was giving about the glia cell and the two neurons, that was a whole process of being humble and approaching something you like. We thought we knew how it worked, but it didn't work that way. And then keeping the kind of like the mental flexibility and the humbleness to be able to like want to learn from the biology, want to learn from other people, and realizing, oh, I was thinking about this wrong, and then reframing. And the most exciting discoveries in science happen that way. I tell people, like, I'll give you one concrete example that everyone is going to relate to. One of
Yeah.
the most important discoveries in science, which led to what's something called the Copernican revolution, was when Copernicus realized that it wasn't the like sun going around the earth, it was the earth going around
It
the
was the
sun.
Earth. Yeah.
And I tell students, look, Copernicus wasn't the first person that looked at the sun. Every
Mhm.
person woke up every day and looked at the sun, but everyone made the assumption because from our perspective, the sun looks like it's going around the earth.
Yeah.
From our perspective, the horizon looks flat. So it's easy to think about the earth as a flat thing because from our perspective, we're so small in the context of the earth, it looks like the horizon is flat. And it looks like the
Yeah.
sun is going around the earth. But scientists, what they use is, so to speak, like a third eye, like a mind eye, to try to see beyond what our senses allow us to see, to question beyond, to think more deeply, to like everyone sees the sun going around the earth, but it takes a scientist to stop and be like, is this our word perspective or is this correct? Let me try to measure it. Let me try to see if this is right. And I think and it's that by definition is a learning process in which you start with a failure because you start with something that you think works a certain way and then you realize, wait, it doesn't work that way. And then that leads to the learning process and the exciting discovery. So I will say every exciting discovery that we've made in science, and I will argue every exciting discovery that any scientist in the history of humanity has made, starts with a failure and starts with a question. And the failure is that moment in which you break which how you thought things worked and you move to a space of like learning and trying to really understand more deeply how things actually work.
Yeah, I think, in my opinion, I think that it's more about like kind of thinking outside the box, questioning everything in that sense of,
That right.
trying to think deeply if you're not, like you said before, if you're not asking questions, you're not
You're not
necessarily
learning.
learning. So
Yeah.
I think that being able to question everything, using that critical thinking to their advantage, I think is the main like way that people can fully understand something and kind of see through it and beyond failure.
That's right.
Kind of wrapping up, is there one message that you would like every young person, especially those from underrepresented backgrounds who dream in working about STEM, to hear? What would it be?
Absolutely. I'll say, in one sentence, don't stop asking questions. The second that you stop asking questions, you stop learning. And it seems pretty simple, but it's very profound. Like, when I was a student around your age, I will feel very uncomfortable being in environments where I was the person that knew the least. And the reason was because, I felt vulnerable and out of place. But now I find myself because I've spent so many years of my life asking the same kind of questions and learning the same things that you were saying, oh, it seems very complex, but the way that I describe it is it's like if I ask you to describe your house, where's the kitchen? You have a mental picture and you can kind of like navigate mentally where the things are in your house. And maybe to me they won't make perfect sense because I've never been there, so they sound complex. But if I go to your house all of a sudden I understand what you're talking about. So it's similar with the conceptual frameworks of how biology works and science. You do it at the beginning when you first face them in class. They might seem confusing, they might seem complex, they might seem out of reach. But as you start getting exposed to them, if you're patient and humble, and you ask questions, you start creating a mental framework of how things work,
Mm,
very similar to how you have a framework of how a house works. And then things will make sense or not. If somebody tells you like, oh, the bathroom is next to the kitchen, but you've been to your house a million times, you're like, no, you must be in the wrong room because the bathroom is not next to the kitchen in my house, kind of thing.
Yeah.
So you can have those conceptual conversations that for somebody that has never been in that space might seem like, oh my god, these two people are geniuses, but they're not. They just have been to that space and they have spent a lot of time thinking about it. But bringing it back to the advice, because I've spent a lot of time thinking about certain topics, sometimes when I'm in rooms, many times as a teacher, I'm the person that knows the most. And what I've realized is the value of being in a space where you know the least and asking questions. Because when I find now in the stage of my career that I'm at, in spaces where I know the least, at a conference or a classroom or elsewhere, I have also realized that I'm the person that's learning the most. So if you're in a space where you feel vulnerable because you don't know, but you're willing to learn, realize that you're the person there that's learning the most, and that has real value beyond the vulnerability you might feel at the moment. If you're asking questions and you put yourself in that space of learning.
Wow. I feel like that kind of takes away, especially for targeted more towards, kind of students. I feel like I can kind of relate to that, kind of learning the least. And I feel like, in a way, I feel like kind of like the stupidest in the class. It makes me feel, kind of uncomfortable and like makes me like feel like a laughing stock. But in a sense where if you're constantly asking questions, like you said, focusing, paying attention, like you're actually, and like you said before, learning the most. And I feel like that's so much
You're the one learning the most, and that has real value. And this is not a 100-yard dash. This is more like a marathon. So when you make that into a practice in your life, people might be laughing at you now. They're not gonna be laughing at you later when you understand the topic much more than they do because you kept on asking questions. Like maybe on Monday you might be the laughing stock because you're asking questions that they think is stupid. But if they think they know it, then what are they doing in the class?
Yeah.
Like
True.
they're in the class to learn.
True.
So if whatever they know is only a tiny bit more than what you know at that moment. So whoever is in the class asking questions and approaching the problem with humbleness, not to humiliate the other, but to genuinely learn, because it's a marathon. Eventually, there's not gonna be no comparison between where that person ends as compared to the person that's trying to pretend they know.
Wow. All right. For our final question, in 6 words or less, what is a sentence that you would like to share with our audience before we wrap up?
Don't stop asking questions.
I had a feeling you're gonna say that. um, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. It was truly an honor to have you on my podcast, and I knew you before the podcast too. As I was doing my psychological research, I came across articles of yours numerous times. So
Thank you.
it's crazy that you're on my screen. It's insane.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you.
To everyone watching, I hope you enjoyed today's conversation. Be sure to leave a comment with your biggest takeaway. Share this episode with someone who's passionate with science, and subscribe so you don't miss a future conversation with inspiring leaders in STEM. Thank you for watching. We'll see you in the next episode. Thank you so much for having us.